Was it really only 8 years ago that people were, crying in the streets and were streaming in the parks and gathering together and feeling that we had really crossed onto this new level by electing a black president for the first time in our history? I had always been pretty skeptical. I had considered myself as a pretty grounded person, but even I got caught up in the emotion. I thought something really had changed, and something really did change. What Obama proved was that a spectacular black individual in this country can achieve spectacular things. But don't ever lose sight of the fact that this was a spectacular individual. The comedian Sinbad jokes that there are no more black men like Obama. There are no more black men with roots in Kansas, born in Hawaii, who went to Harvard Law School and lived in Chicago. That's just not going to happen again. That's a spectacular individual. But I'm worried about normal folks, those of us who are not spectacular. And unfortunately, it looks like we're in for a long road. One of the things I think we lose sight of is the amount of racism that immediately followed that euphoria and really followed, Obama as soon as he, declared himself a part of the national conversation. When Obama ran for Senate in 2004, the opposing party imported a candidate to run against him, another black man from Harvard, just imported him, a guy from Maryland by the name of Alan Keyes, just because they needed another black man to run against him. When he declared that he was going to be a presidential candidate, photos sprung up of him in Somali garb. Radio hosts took to playing music jingles entitled Puff the Magic Negro. Operatives claimed Michelle Obama could be found on tape yelling, "Whitey." Y'all don't even remember the Whitey tape. Some of y'all was about 10 years old, but it happened. When Obama ran against Hillary Clinton in West Virginia, fully 20% of the people there said that they voted against him because he was black. This was open. This was an actual poll. I think one of the problems with the conversation around racism that I've tried to have, based on the book that I've tried to have around the country, is the notion that this somehow only endangers black people. But I'm here to tell you that it endangers all of us. This started Anybody here familiar with the writer James Baldwin? Not enough people, but I hear you out there. He wrote an essay called On Being White and Other Lies. And the argument Baldwin made was that race was in fact not real. What he noted was that race, in fact, was always the result of power, that any notion of you being black or you being white was ultimately the result of some sort of power relationship between two people. That doesn't mean that you having blonde hair is not real. It doesn't mean that you having darker skin is not real. It doesn't mean that you having fuller lips is not real. But it means that the categories that we assign to people who are black and people who are white are ultimately based on people trying to take things from other people. They're ultimately based on power relationships. We know this to be true. There is no categorization of black or white that can sustain the test of time and space. I am black standing here before you in 2016 here in Boston. But if I were in, say, New Orleans 250 years ago, I might be something else. If I were in Algeria right now, I might be characterized as something else. We have something in this country that's called the one-drop rule, and there's no reason why the idea that just because you have one drop of black blood, you would have to be considered black. There's no stipulation, there's no actual biological test that you can take that across time and history can separate black people from white people. It only makes sense when you're having a conversation about taking things from each other. And this idea that race is somehow wielded, it's somehow beyond that, it's somehow something that should be fought over or should be fought on, and it's as old as this country. In fact, older. In 1619, when the first group of African Americans arrived here in chains, they were not the only people who were bonded. They arrived and they found Irish immigrants here who were in a system that is called indentured servitude. And the only difference between these two groups of people was one group served longer than the other group of people. It was a real difference, but in general, this group of people cooperated together, they stood together, they fought together, they made love together, had children together, they rebelled together, they drank together. They did all the things that people do when they're social with each other. And over the course of history, basically what you saw was a division. The problem with America early in its history was there was a large swath of land. And what was needed was a bonded class of people who could work that land. And the decision was made that if you could separate two groups of people, if you could make one group of people ascribed as the workers, if you could give them less rights, if you could somehow make them lower than the other group of people, then you could have a system that could work. And slowly you see the foundation of this idea of race. And you can literally see this in the laws. You can see black people in the 17th century being stripped of rights, and you can see quote-unquote white people who were not considered white before being given rights. In 1705, for instance, the Virginia Assembly passed a law that made it a crime for any black person to defend themselves. At that same time, they passed another law that said the idea or the notion that a child who was born to a white mother and a black father must necessarily be a slave, but not the other way around. That's race being created. That's the idea that we still live with today. We got to the point in the 19th century when the illustrious John C. Calhoun, who was considered one of our greatest senators from South Carolina, said that the great division in our society is not between rich and poor, but between black and white. That is the entrenchment of the idea of slavery. It was the idea of whiteness that ultimately brought the country to civil war in 1860. I had a period in my life, I guess it's been almost 10 years now, where I was deeply interested in the Civil War. It kind of took me over. And I would drive to all these battlefields. I would drive down to Petersburg, Virginia. I would drive to the wilderness. I went into Tennessee and looked at battlefields. And I would drag my wife with me, and I would drag my son with me, and they would get upset and, say, "Daddy, why are you taking us to see all of this history?" And what I wanted them to understand is that history was them, that everything about them started in that place. Some 600, 700,000, the numbers are being revised upwards every day, died during the Civil War. And when I would go to these battlefields, people would often, say, when I would ask, well, why did they die? They would say, well, it was states' rights. They were defending their honor. We were fighting because you came down here. And what I sensed behind that was the inability to talk about what had actually happened. In 1860 in this country, there were 4 million people living below the Mason-Dixon line who were living as slaves. They were the majority of the people living in South Carolina. They were the majority of the people living in Mississippi. They were half the people living in Georgia, half the people living in Louisiana. And taken together, and I hate to talk about this like this, but this is what this group of people were. Taken together, this was considered the most valuable property in the country. In 1860, had you taken all the nascent banks, had you taken all the nascent factories, had you taken all the shipping, all the wealth that America had produced, and you put it together in one pile, the enslaved African Americans, valued at some $3 billion, would have been worth more. That's a lot of wealth. In 1840, 60% of the exports out of this country were cotton. They came through the hands of enslaved black people. So slavery was not just an institution that gave money and resources to the South. It was something that the country itself based itself on. Indeed, it's hard to imagine this country without slavery. And after the Civil War ended, after those 700,000 human beings had died, after that 4 million African Americans were set free, it's not like the country got together and said, okay, you know what, slavery was wrong, go on your merry way. What followed was a 100-year campaign of terror. I tell people all the time, we have got into this ritual, and you see it, even today. I went yesterday and I went to vote, and they gave me a very nice sticker that said, I voted, right? Did you guys get that? I really hope all of you guys got that. I really hope, because then we'll have to have another conversation. But they gave you a nice sticker that said, I voted. And really what it does is it obscures the deep significance of voting, the deep power that is actually in voting. When you vote, you have some sort of say in how your society spends its tax dollars. You actually have, some sort of membership. It's your end of the social contract. For 100 years, for almost 100 years, Black people living in half this country did not have the ability to exercise that right. That's what followed the Civil War. There was a concentrated effort to restrict the places and times Black people could vote. And this goes back to the Civil War. It goes back to our history and slavery. And so Black people who came out of the Civil War, expecting the right to vote, expecting the right to have some sort of say in their society, weren't given that. And whenever somebody taxes you for something and doesn't give you the same return on your services, they're plundering you. They're taking something from you. And that was the situation African Americans lived in this country until the 1960s. That means that there are people in this room. That means there are people here. That means there are people that were voting yesterday. That means there are people in my family who, within living memory, can recall a time when the government basically existed to plunder them. In 2008, we thought that was dead. That was a huge, huge mistake. We had deeply, deeply underestimated ourselves. We had deeply, deeply underestimated our past. The last 8 years have been, I don't know, for me as an African American, just a period of tremendous pride. But I feel like I took my eye off the ball for a minute. It's easy to forget. And we're gonna forget this more, by the way, over the next 10 years when, everybody and their mama is gonna say they voted for Barack Obama. I guarantee you that's what's gonna happen next. It's easy to forget that the majority, not 10%, not 20%, not 30%, the majority of the opposition party did not believe that the President of the United States was born here, did not believe that he actually was a Christian. We have to take ownership of our history. There's this sort of deep feeling that because we didn't do whatever happened in 1860, because we, maybe our ancestors just got here at the turn of the 20th century, that somehow we are not responsible to our history. We are not responsible to our society. This is the worst species of patriotism that you can ever imagine. It is patriotism a la carte. Because all of us celebrate on the 4th of July, even though none of us were there to fight the battle for independence. All of us take off during President's Day. All of us honor treaties and pay taxes for things that we aren't directly responsible for. That extends even into our most painful areas. And if we don't deal with it, if we don't confront it, if we don't become more open about directly addressing it, we won't be looking at just another dark 4 years. We'll be looking at another dark 8, 10, 20, 25. Thank you guys so much. Have a great time.